Hi everybody, my name's Hannah and I'm from the Relationships and Sexuality Education Project. Before we begin today, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm standing on, that is Whadjuk Noongar Boodja here in Boorloo, otherwise known as Perth. And I'd like to acknowledge the ways in which their culture and continuing connection to land, waterways and skies impact us here in Boorloo and the richness of our lives in general. Today, I'm just going to quickly speak a little bit about the Relationships and Sexuality Education and what we do, and then I will introduce our presenter for the day. So the Relationships and Sexuality Education Project is funded by the Department of Health in WA. We have a number of activities to support teachers in upskilling in the area of relationships and sexuality education. So we host a variety of webinars 3 to 4 times a year. And obviously you're attending one of those now. So if this is your first time, welcome. And if this is your many times, you've been here many times, welcome back. So the other thing that we do besides these after school webinars is probably our core business is our 2-day PD. So we've just had our annual Perth 2-day PD last week, and that was amazing. We had about 40 teachers from around the state, mostly based here, attend our Curtin campus and to spend 2 days really getting hands-on and interactive with all sorts of different ways to teach RSE to students across all year levels. And finally, our other main thing that we do is every couple of years we have a symposium. So that's coming up on October 27th. We have an awesome range of workshops locked in. Our keynote speaker is Katrina Marson, who is just absolutely incredible. If you've never seen her speak, I think it's worth coming to the symposium just to see her, honestly. But there is heaps of other stuff going on. And we also have the opportunity for any school staff or people working in schools to nominate themselves for an RSE award. We have 4 categories, and you can find all the information and how to nominate for that on our website, which is just, if you Google RSE project, you will come across it immediately. Okay, so enough about us, even though we are super fabulous. Another super fabulous person is Karen Triggs, who is joining us today to talk to us about ADHD and sexuality. So Karen is an accredited psychosexual therapist, relationships counsellor and trauma-focused art therapist working in a busy private practice in Southwest Sydney. She's also a registered member of the Australian and New Zealand Creative Art Therapists Association and has several postgraduate qualifications, including a Master's in Art Psychotherapy, and is currently working towards accreditation as an EMDR practitioner. Wow, so busy. Karen is also a member of the ACA College of Supervisors and enjoys supporting and mentoring other counsellors. She is also a past president of the New South Wales Society of Australian Sexologists. Karen started her career as Karen, sorry, I think I've made a mistake there, but Karen is proudly neurodivergent cisgender woman who not only has ADHD, but also has adult children and grandchildren who live with ADHD. She is passionate about helping people who have ADHD to have fulfilling and satisfying relationships and sex lives. Karen was born in Zimbabwe and also has lived in South Africa and Botswana. When not working, Karen can be found creating in her art studio, going on camping adventures and spending time with her grandchildren. So without further ado, please welcome Karen.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm delighted to be here, and I think it's absolutely awesome the work that you're doing with the RSE project. It's so encouraging to hear what you're doing, and even having a symposium. So that's fantastic. I'd like to acknowledge the Dharawal people, that's the land on which I am, and also the Kalkadoon people. My two grandchildren are members of the Kalkadoon people in Queensland, so just to acknowledge them. So yes, just a little bit about myself is that I am neurodivergent. I was diagnosed with ADHD later in life, during COVID actually. And I think that seems to be a catalyst for a lot of adults living with ADHD to start getting diagnosed because of some of the issues that we faced during that time, particularly when working at home. So I have grandchildren that have ADHD as well. So I do firstly also want to apologize because I got horribly mixed up with the time last week and I was ready to be on at 8 when I should have been on at 6. So I do apologize for the inconvenience caused there. I think we've got the, I'm just trying to, yeah. Oh, where are we? I think we've got a breakout room now. Is that right? Hannah?
Yep, I can put them into breakouts, maybe of 2.
Yep, that would, yeah. So what I would like you to do is just to go into a breakout room and just brainstorm as many words that you can come up with that you may have associated or heard in relation to ADHD.
All right, going in now.
And then Hannah, will you just keep an eye on that time?
Yeah. How long do you want me to?
Maybe a minute and a half at the most.
Okay. All right. They're coming out now, Karen.
Okay.
They should be just about 40 seconds.
Awesome.
All right, everyone should be back.
Fantastic. So I'd just like to invite you to, for one person from each group, just to share some of the words or terms that you might have come up with.
Does anyone want to put them in the chat perhaps? Or call them out? Feel free to unmute yourself.
There we go.
Hello, I'm Donna coming from Melbourne. Hi, everybody. I'm going to give apologies to the person who I was in a room with because I didn't write down her name, and there was so much I was trying to get and capture that, of course, I've forgotten her name. So ADHD of me. So this is a quick list of what we had. We had competing attention interests, scattered, overthinking, catastrophizing, stimulation seeking, hyper focus with hypo energy afterwards, newness, as in seeking newness, and then the last one was systems orientated.
Thanks, Donna. That's a good list. Anyone else have anything to add there? Okay, well, I will just share a little bit from my perspective is that I was called ditzy, dreamy, got into trouble at school. In fact, I can remember being actually whacked over the head. That was back in the 70s for not concentrating and paying attention. I didn't know at the time that, and I don't think my teacher knew at the time what was going on. But often there's these, impulsive, loud, crazy, ditzy, scattered, some often very negative terms that people living with ADHD get called. So I kind of wanted to just draw your attention to the language that we use and the words and the terminology that we use around children and people living with ADHD, but particularly in the school context, because I think having been a teacher myself at one point in time, I can remember being absolutely appalled by the way that sometimes staff would refer to children or students who are having some difficulties with being able to be settled in class and all sorts of other things. So I think it's important to just bear in mind that there is still a lot of stigma attached and negative connotations. Does anyone want to comment on that at this point? If not, we'll just keep going. Okay. Can you see that okay? Yeah. So just a bit of information about ADHD. It's a specific neurological condition. So it's not a behavioral condition. It's a neurological condition which affects both children and adults. It involves predominantly two key neurotransmitters. One is dopamine and the other is noradrenaline. And that's the dopamine is an important one to keep an eye on. There are three different subtypes. So the DSM criteria changed a couple of years ago, I think. And so it used to be ADD and then ADHD. Now it's just ADHD and then these three subtypes. So there's one which is hyperactive, and that's the impulsive, swinging from the chandeliers kind of presentation, which is much easier to diagnose. And then the inattentive, and that's often the one that is missed, and then combined, which is a bit of both. So the issue is not so much that it's a deficit in attention, but more that it's around directing and regulating where that attention goes. So it's not so much a deficit, but more of a regulation difficulty. And that presents primarily as this compromised executive functioning. And that, again, is really important to hold on to this whole idea around the executive functioning, because that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at how that impacts sexuality and relationships. So executive functioning, we'll come back to that, but basically we're looking at organization, planning, working memory, self-control, and perception of time. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about executive function. Child onset is usually, it's always a key feature of ADHD, and we usually see symptoms before 13. But if somebody has been able to really function quite well, you might see symptoms a little bit after that, that age. It's also important to note that ADHD is often accompanied by other, what we call comorbid disorders, such as depression, anxiety, bipolar, learning difficulties, sometimes sensory issues. So you don't often see just ADHD. There will usually be what I call a companion. And that's also an important thing to kind of factor in when we're thinking about how this might affect sexuality. Russell Barkley is one of the leading researchers, experts in the world of ADHD, and he says it's not that the individual doesn't know what to do, it is that somehow it doesn't get done. So that is his perspective on that side of things. So it's not like people don't know what to do, it's just we just can't manage to get ourselves organized enough sometimes to do that. So the DSM-5 criteria is the diagnostic criteria. I don't want to go into that too much because I assume I'm talking mainly to teachers here. And that requires at least 5 of these kinds of symptoms. I've included a few more, but these are the kind of symptoms in these 2 domains for at least 6 months in each of those areas or one of those areas which impair functioning and is inconsistent with the development level. So it needs to be getting in the way of being able to function and getting in the way of learning or quality of life. What we also know is that the brain development in the frontal lobe may be slightly delayed in adolescent ADHD by about 2 to 3 years. So if you're thinking that most people will have matured by around the age of 24, we're kind of pushing it out a little bit further than that. And that's something that I've definitely noticed. We also need to remember that it's on a continuum of severity from mild to severe. So it's not no. So I guess what that tells us then is that people are going to present in lots of different ways. And I think it's a bit like ASD. No 2 people are the same. No 2 people present exactly the same. So when we're looking at those 2 areas, we've got the hyperactivity and impulsivity, trouble sitting still, restless, fidgety, always on the go, overly talkative, blurting out and interrupting, trouble waiting for turns, low tolerance for frustration, risk-taking activities, and being very in the moment and not being able to think of consequences. I can remember with my 2 boys, I would put them into timeout and timeout again, and then the next day will be timeout again for the same thing, because they just were not able to associate whatever they were doing with the consequence from the day before. So it's not that people don't care, or it's just that they just do not associate, they can't think ahead enough to remember what the consequence is. And that is probably common to teenagers anyway, but more so with people who are living with ADHD. So these are usually the students who have this kind of presentation are easier to spot than perhaps ones that are more on the inattentive side. And so in terms of inattention, there may be poor attention to details and what seems like careless mistakes, difficulty sustaining attention. So that can be time blindness. It's just not recognizing that time is changing. They often don't listen well, so have trouble listening, trouble with finishing tasks or following instructions, so they can't remember, difficulty with organization and problem solving, dislike of activities requiring to sustain mental effort, or that could be quite boring. Often tend to lose things, can be easily distracted or spaced out. And that can sometimes happen in an ADHD kind of meltdown type of situation, and be forgetful. So for me, I find that when it comes to numbers and time, I do have difficulty. And sometimes I look back at something and cannot understand how I missed what it was. So that can be a bit of yeah, so these things, you can see how those would may be hard to spot, harder to see or notice than the other ones, hyperactivity and impulsivity. These are some other things that are not in the diagnostic criteria, but often accompany ADHD are considered to be other symptoms. So one is that people often have emotional difficulties and feel emotions very intensely. There may be poor self-esteem, whether that's because they have struggled at school or have difficulties at home. There's often this poor self-esteem, low confidence. They can be irritable, angry, and easily frustrated. And then this other one is easily overwhelmed. So overwhelm can be a huge difficulty for people living with ADHD. And often people will describe that they feel different. They felt different, like they didn't quite fit in or belong, or maybe a bit weird in some way. On an interpersonal level, we notice that there can be social isolation and fewer friends, or an overdependence on others, can be inflexible, find it difficult to change track, may have difficulty with cooperating with others, can be easily triggered and struggle to manage emotions. If you've worked with adolescents, you'll know that that can often be a struggle as it is. And then if we add ADHD onto that, it's even more difficult. Sometimes have poor social skills, particularly if there's issues around waiting for turns or blurting out, or not being able to filter what they say. Desperate need to fit in. And so that can lead to unhealthy friendships. And sometimes there can be a hypersexual interest. This is another area that is a little bit controversial. So some people are saying, some of the I don't call them researchers, but some people are a bit critical about what we know as RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria, and others are recognizing that it is part of the picture. So if my understanding is that when ADHD was first conceptualized, this was an element. And then for some reason, because it's harder to measure, it was excluded from the DSM category, but apparently in Europe, they still pay a little bit more attention to it. So that's my understanding. I am not sure there's not a lot of research around RSD, but it is an experience of intense catastrophic emotional pain that is triggered by imagined or real rejection, criticism, disappointment, or failure to live up to your own expectations. And dysphoria is that intense, unbearable pain. So it's a really intense emotion to feel. When I realized that was an actual thing, it was a huge relief to me to know that, oh, there's actually this thing that I sometimes struggle with, and that's helped me to then work specifically on managing those feelings when they come up, because I know what it is. But you can imagine that if you're an adolescent, how difficult that would be to navigate if you had those feelings. And when you know that, I would hate to be an adolescent right now, because they can't switch. If they're having problems at school, they can't switch off because it's social media's there. So this would be a huge thing to keep an eye out for. So what these things then lead to these are some examples of maladaptive coping strategies. So there's people pleasing, avoidance, numbing, substance use, and then masking to fit in. And masking is just constantly conscious and unconscious adaptations to be able to get along and be able to cope and I guess survive in this world with ADHD. I think that people, from an adult perspective, I think the people that are being diagnosed now were able to mask really well, and probably we're more on the inattentive side of things, and now that started to unravel. And as I mentioned before, there's some association with COVID that I think has led to that. Okay. So I just want to preface this as well. So there's not a lot of information around ADHD and non-binary or trans folk. And so it's hard to, I was trying to think about what to use for the heading here, and I almost wrote ADHD and AFAB, assigned female at birth, but I didn't. But I just want to bracket that to kind of go, okay, when I'm talking about this, there could well be young people who are AFAB who may have this kind of presentation. But there's not a lot of research in general around ADHD and sexuality, let alone ADHD and adolescent sexuality. But in terms of girls, ADHD can often be misdiagnosed as anxiety or depression. The bias in the research is very male, there's a bias in the research, it's very male focused and tends to focus on the hyperactive symptoms. And the screening tools often overlook the underlying executive function difficulties, particularly the inattentive type. That girls are more likely to have inattentive features. That we know from the research that they are at higher risk for self-harm and suicidality. They are often skillful at compensatory behaviors that mask symptoms to avoid stigma of diagnosis, or just feeling left out because they may not be actually conscious of that. We also know that girls living with ADHD can be impacted by trauma more intensely. It's not clear in the research what the correlation there or what the link is exactly. Boys are often diagnosed more in childhood, but as we get through to adult diagnoses, the females catch up. Girls are also socialized to please, be perfect, look good, be sexy. So that also complicates things because they try and do that to fit in. They may feel weird or different. Often have issues around perfectionism, overwhelm, and OCD. And hyperactivity may present as fidgety or restless rather than being very bouncy. I thought it would be helpful because I'm always conscious when I'm talking about ADHD in these contexts that we're focusing often on the problematic aspects. But I think it's just important to look at the strengths of ADHD. So people with ADHD often have this laser focus, which is also described as hyperfocus. That can be a positive. Imaginative, creative, determined, passionate, caring, innovative, can think outside the square, can be quite adventurous, often very accepting, can be quite resilient, fun to be with, can multitask, can be energizing to be around, generous and sensitive, and also can come up with new ideas. I've included this here just to go through the medications that are generally used. There are 3 different classes of medications, stimulants being the first port of call, and usually are the most widely used and work quite quickly, but they do have side effects. So it can be tricky to find the most effective one. And I think that's important to notice, because having been on stimulant medication myself and working with adults who are on stimulant medication and understanding some of the side effects from that, and then having grandchildren on medication and recognizing, oh, you know, one of these is not working as well, there's a negative side effect. So it could be irritability, anxiety can be some of the side effects. But basically that's what's increasing this dopamine. So it's working on the dopamine and the norepinephrine, and helps with improving focus, mood, attention to detail, impulsivity, and memory. I've listed the ones prescribed in Australia, and there's this was more, these side effects more to do with adults, so we won't really be thinking it could possibly affect adolescents. But if you look at headaches, insomnia, and can be irritable and anxious. Then there are the alpha adrenogecs, so that's cataprest and intuitive, and these are basically beta blockers, and they may be used to complement the stimulants, or when the stimulants can't be used. They help more with aggressive behavior and hyperactivity. There is some suggestion about them being used for RSD, can be used for tics as well. Issues can be around low blood pressure and dizziness. So there's those ones. And then the SNRIs. So these are similar to your SSRI medication that you would generally use for anxiety and depression. But these ones are only used for ADHD treatment as an alternative, and can help with symptoms like distractibility, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. The main one in Australia is Strattera. But it is important to note that there are some quite concerning side effects in terms of sexual function. So there can be erectile issues, issues with libido, and difficulties with menstruation. And we also know that there is some evidence to suggest that post-SSRI sexual function issues are a thing. So it's just important to note what side effects are there from the SNRIs. We also have some good evidence to suggest that omega-3s and saffron are quite helpful in managing symptoms of ADHD. So now, when we look at how does this impact ADHD, how does this impact sexuality? So it's almost like there's a collision. We know that, sorry, I think there's a little bit of an error type there. We don't have a lot of research, but the research that we do have shows that teens living with ADHD are at higher risk of unplanned pregnancy before age 20. And for girls, ADHD is a direct factor. So this is the only area where ADHD is directly implicated. Other problems, risks could be developing lifelong STIs, engaging in risky hypersexual activities, higher numbers of sexual partners. Girls living with ADHD are at higher risk of sexual assault, regretful use of electronic devices to share sexual images, exposure to unsafe sexual situations. With most of these, ADHD is a contributing factor and not necessarily a causal one. And remember that other mental health companion factors could be implicated in this as well. Okay, so if we are now looking at what are some things that we could do around helping adolescents with sexuality. So we kind of want to take a mindful approach and be intentional. So the questions that we're wanting to emphasize or help them to think about is it what I really want to do? Is this my decision or someone else's? Can I stay safe doing this? how will I recall or remember this or look back when I'm older? So that's what we're wanting to focus on, is those particular questions. And so we're looking at 3 different aspects. One is health. So we want to develop a well-informed, sex-positive, realistic understanding of sexuality. We want to be able to empower young people to make healthy choices and understand the negative and positive consequences. And of course, as you would know, scare tactics do not work too well. So really well-informed, complete information is important. So health, then we want them to start, we want to try and reinforce and get the message across that there is a heart connection. So how does that work out in conjunction, in relation to other people? So first, around developing self-awareness and self-compassion, being able to develop emotional literacy and emotional regulation skills. And that to me is really, really key. Linking sex to connection and the expression of love. And then asking the question, is there a chance I'll regret this later on in life? So we're trying to then look at consequences, which can be really hard for young people living with ADHD. And of course, respect and consent. So if you're not aware of Betty Martin's Wheel of Consent, that would be a great resource to have a look at. I'm not sure whether any of the people in the RSC have done any work around adapting that for work with adolescents. That would be interesting. Making respectful sexual choices, being honest about intentions, and being able to have empathy for others and see, or partners, to pause and evaluate. And so we're looking at the idea of emotional consent, not just yes or no. Are they able to recognize what real consent actually looks like and feels like? So we're wanting to make sure we're sex positive, we're not being judgmental, we're listening, we're not lecturing, so that we can have open conversations. And I think that with adolescents and with adolescents living with ADHD, there's a lot of repetition. It's finding creative ways to reinforce and help this become, I suppose, as internalized as possible. In terms of communication, another way that we can work with young people is to teach them, is to use the ACE method of communication. So it's very simple, but it's acknowledging what's going on. So if somebody comes to you or there's an issue, you're acknowledging and affirming what's going on, showing compassion and understanding. So by showing compassion, you're not agreeing with the actions. And I think that can be sometimes tricky for teachers stuck in situations. But showing compassion is not agreeing with the actual actions. And then exploring options or explaining. So redirecting, explaining, exploring options, expectations for future situations, and then asking how you can support the young person to do this. But if you're modeling this kind of communication, then I guess there's an added benefit that you're wanting to help them be able to use this kind of communication with their peers, if possible. Right. And then just in terms of coming back to that executive functioning, because that's where the ADHD is getting in the way. And so executive functioning is high-level cognitive processes that are essential for success. And the problem is in filtering information and sustaining attention. So we've got a couple of different areas. One is the capacity for self-awareness. and insight and self-reflection. The ability to inhibit responses, so self-control and tolerance for delayed gratification can be tricky. That's tricky for lots of people, not just adolescents, but even more so for people living with ADHD. Working memory, so memory in the moment and remembering to remember. So often people with ADHD have long-term memory is fine, but it's the short-term memory in the moment that can be challenging. Emotional self-regulation and emotional intelligence, so identifying emotions in oneself and others, being able to express these emotions safely, and then responding appropriately to others' emotions. Self-motivation, this is often linked to this lack of dopamine. So dopamine is what makes you feel, it's the pleasure hormone. So when there's low dopamine, often there's a difficulty with self-motivation because it's just not enough get up and go internally, biologically, to be able to get going or to sustain effort. So I find in the morning, I have a lot of problem with this early in the morning. Once my medication's kicked in, it's like, right, I'm on, I can do anything. So doing what needs to be done without external pressure and being able to persist with a task. So if a task is difficult or boring, that's where there's going to be problems. Planning and problem solving, using information to organize and think through consequences. So if you look at these, you can already start to see where that could, how that could contribute to managing sexuality for adolescents. But the good news is that if we can work on these areas without necessarily having to be linking them explicitly to sexual behavior, because sometimes that's a challenge in a school situation. You have limits around what you can do and what you can't do. But if we can start, if we're working more on helping them with these things, then we're basically teaching life skills, which hopefully will then translate into that. Oh, there was something I forgot to mention is that one of the other symptoms could be sensory issues. And the reason why that's important to note is that if somebody has sensory issues, touch might be problematic for them. And that would obviously impact how they connect with others sexually and what they experience as pleasurable. So these are some of the things that you can do. One is to teach self-compassion. And we know that self-compassion is far more effective than teaching self-worth. So having self-compassion, teaching emotional literacy, the mindful approach, as we talked about before, so that's being able to stay present in the moment and helping them to do that in creative ways. I think teaching values and boundaries is really helpful, because if young people have an understanding of what their core values are and how they intend to live that out, and may help them to establish firmer boundaries, or to even just be able to reflect when they haven't been able to do that. To be patient, open, and curious, to integrate distress tolerance skills. And I think this is relevant because if people with ADHD are experiencing these intense emotions and they are also adolescents, then that is going to be really, really difficult, particularly if there is RSD. So I was thinking about, people getting into a relationship. There's one person's just absolutely madly in love with this person. There's this, they're having sex, and the next minute this person's ghosted and that particular partner's gone off. And you've got somebody left with this absolutely overwhelming rejection, sensitive dysphoria, and that could place them at high risk. So I think being able to teach distress tolerance skills is very helpful. Building relationships with young people, Working with parents if possible. I know from my work with adolescents and as a school counsellor, sometimes that was the most challenging aspect of trying to make a difference or help students. Providing accurate factual information and also being explicit about executive function skills, so that we're being very clear. So some classrooms will have explicit information around specifically on executive function. Explore sensory self-soothing, so using toys for stimming or things that can help self-soothe. There's all sorts of things that I've seen around. EFT tapping could also be helpful, and that's something you could do as a whole class activity. Teaching decision-making skills, so using some kind of decision-making matrix, and I guess that that mindfulness one may be a good start, that we mentioned about before. I also thought, now this might, some people may be familiar with what I mean by parts language, but that can be super helpful as well, because it's very non-judgmental. So, oh, so that part of you that got really angry and made you storm out the classroom, tell me about that part, and getting curious about the one part that tells you that you really want to have sex with this person, and there's another part that says no, that's probably not a good idea, and just exploring that could be really helpful. And if anybody wants any information around where you can find out more about that, I'll be happy to provide that. Here is just a list of some resources. There is the Attitude magazine is fantastic. It's got lots of short, easily digestible, very helpful information for parents, for professionals, for teachers, for students, and it's trying to think of the words. Russell Barkley, who is one of the experts in ADHD, is on the board. So everything that they put out has been carefully screened and vetted, and is quite reliable. So I would say that's important. There is a link in the chat box explaining ADHD to teachers, PDF, which can be quite helpful. And it's in the form of an iceberg, I think. So it will look like an iceberg. So it's got what you see on the top, and it's an easy little chart that I thought would be handy for you. And that's from Attitude magazine. There is also a questionnaire that is on there. And I've also put in the chat box, we've also put in the chat box how to talk about ADHD. So just some tips around the language that you can use when talking about that. There's another resource, Managing ADHD in Schools. This one is quite good, that could be useful for students. Reachout.com, Learning to Love Having ADHD. And this book here, The Neurodivergent Friendly Workbook of DBT Skills by Sunny Jane Wise, who is neurodivergent themselves, and has some handy exercises that you could use to teach distress tolerance skills fairly simply. And that comes from dialectical behavior therapy. Doesn't mean you're doing therapy, but they're just exercises that could be helpful in exploring different aspects with all adolescents, actually. And that's kind of it. So I might stop sharing there.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was super informative. I'm just going to open it up to participants. I know there are a couple of questions in the chat during. But if anyone in the room would like to ask some questions, so Karen, now is the time. Well, the question in the chat was around the pregnancy start that you shared earlier, which was where did that come from, that young girls were more likely to experience teen pregnancy?
There is a research study. I can't remember exactly which one off the top of my head, but it was a research study that I can find and send a link to you if you would like.
That would be fantastic, and then I can share it with in the follow-up email that we'll send out after. I have a question around how teachers can make sure their RSE lessons include ADHD or neurodivergent people. Like, is there a way to adapt them to make sure that they're engaging and that kind of thing?
I would say, well, one, being mindful of what the executive function issues are. So sustaining concentration, how that information is presented, maybe smaller, chunking things into smaller bits rather than having a huge, big task. Helping them to manage time. So I've got this little thing here, which is actually yellow, so it's not white. It's called a time cube. And I'll just show you now. Oh, you can't really see, but it changes color.
Right.
That will say to me, so I can set a timer, 60 minutes, and then over time it will change color. So it will let me know when I'm got 10 minutes to go, when I'm halfway. So that could be something else as well, as knowing that what's that student's capacity to be able to stay focused. Letting them be, if they start to get restless, let them get up and go and walk around. So it's more around looking at how you could, I guess, in a classroom situation. There's actually a good handout that I think I've got a link to it, more specifically about lessons and things like that. So I'll send that to you, because I think there's just so many things you can do, and it will really depend on what that student's difficulties are and where they're having difficulty. If they're hyperactive, impulsive, you may need to do certain things. If there is an inattention, it might be reminders, it might be helping them to stay on track and on task. It might be looking at their learning style. Are they more visual? Are they more auditory? Are they more tactile? Do they need to do things with their hands? Are they better working one-on-one with somebody else as a peer sort of support in the classroom without compromising the peer? So it's really sort of looking at what they might need more on an individual basis, if that makes sense.
Yep. So just remaining quite student-centered there.
Yeah, and I think focusing on being very explicit about executive functioning so that everyone's on the same page.
Actually, that leads me to another question that I had, which is that you mentioned EFT tapping, and I just wondered if you could explain that a little bit. Okay,
so EFT tapping is emotional freedom technique. I think that's what it means. But it's like emotional acupuncture. And Bond University has done quite a lot of research around using EFT for eating disorders. And I think in New Zealand, when they had a couple of years ago, when they had that shooting incident, they used it in schools with students to help with self-soothing. So it's a stress management technique, and there is a growing body of evidence to show that it can help down regulate. So basically all you're doing, it's quite simple. You can, there's a website called the Tapping Solution that's got some information around that, but you're just tapping on different parts of the body. So you would start tapping on here, and there's usually a setup statement that would go like this: even though I feel really anxious, I love and accept myself. And then it'll be this anxiety, this stress, whatever. And you're tapping, and you do that a few times, and then you kind of see how that then helps to students to feel calmer. So you don't need to be qualified to do it or anything like that. You just need to have a little go with it. But it can be quite helpful. And I find that if you're trying to teach students things that they can do in the moment, because it's going to be very hard for somebody living with ADHD, particularly a young person, in a situation where they are going to have to make a decision, to suddenly remember, oh, I've got to think about this, and I've got to think about that, and I've got to think about the next thing, because they're going to just be thinking about what I need to do, what I want to do in this moment, that time blindness. And not being able to go, oh, well, if I do this now, then that's what this is going to happen.
Excellent. I think that sounds like a great activity for people to do after recess or lunch potentially as well.
Particularly if they're having social challenges and difficulties that are caused upset. Yeah.
I might just throw it out to the rest of the group and see if there are any other questions that people have come up with while we've been chatting.
Yeah, please don't feel afraid to ask anything. Oh, the one thing I thought I might just maybe mention as well, is I didn't really focus on too much because I was worried we were going to run out of time, was the hypersexuality. So there's been a fair amount of research done on hypersexuality with adults, and usually the research has been a little bit skewed in terms of homosexual boys and men. So there's a little bit of a bias there. It's a problem. But I think that people with ADHD could be more at risk because they may the dopamine seeking, so it's that dopamine, needing to get a dopamine hit or to feel good, may present itself in the form of hypersexuality, and that might manifest as compulsive or problematic porn use.
Right. Okay, and so that might also feed into the other stat that I think you showed, which was that young girls were more likely to be at risk of sexual assault.
Could be, yes. Yeah.
Because I found that very interesting.
Yeah, but I suppose if you think about it, if you're going somewhere with your friends and there's some hot person that you're attracted to, but you don't really know them, and you've had a couple of drinks and you just go, yep, I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to go home with this person. I don't really know them, but I feel good and I think everything's great, and I'm just going to go and do that.
Right.
You know, and often there is this link with substance use as well. So you can see how challenging it is for yes, and somebody said RSD. at play as well.
Yes, that's an excellent point. My last question before we wrap up, unless someone else wants to jump in, was around the rejection sensitivity dysphoria, and if you had any specific tips about helping to cope with that real sense of rejection, even if they weren't ghosted. Like if someone, lots of teenagers just say, oh, I'm not your boyfriend anymore, that kind of thing.
I think being brave enough to suggest that perhaps there's this thing called RSD and this is what it feels like. So giving that information and saying, okay, so if this is what's going on, then how can we manage our feelings, and having some of those emotional regulation skills in place. So who have you got in your support system? Remember the hand model, what's 5 people? Who have you got there to support you? How can you cope with these intense feelings? But I think being explicit about it can be helpful. That's certainly what I found with my clients, is letting them know, oh, there's an actual thing. And often they're going, oh, wow, that's exactly how I feel. I'm not weird. I'm not stupid. But it's in what do we then do with those feelings? How best can we self-soothe? What do we need to do in terms of that? Oh, and there's, yep. So,
excellent.
That's a good idea. Yep.
So I think Leah's just asking if you have any other good resources for teaching RSE to students.
Probably not. That's not my area, is intellectual and physical disability. That's probably not my area that I have a lot of skill in. I think it's usually around being concrete, having concrete things, keeping your language very simple, using images, and adapting what you've got.
I think, Leah, as well, if you want to send an email to the RSE project, last year I did a scoping review and I did collect a lot of different resources about adapting for intellectual and physical disabilities. They're not exactly specific resources, they're more just about how to adapt existing resources for teaching students with intellectual and physical disabilities. So yeah, they're not specific resources, but just tips on adapting. But if you send through an email, I'll definitely be able to provide you with some of those articles.
That sounds like a good thing. It could also, with the RSD affirmations that you could use. This is the workbook that I found, and you can see, like, it's super colorful and easy to look at.
Yeah, not too information dense.
No, and there is a little section here on RSD, sensory self-soothing, meltdown mapping. That's quite a useful resource that you can draw things from.
I think the emotional self-soothing sounds like a very broad reaching one as well, because I know a lot of students with anxiety can find benefits from emotional self-soothing as well. So it's great when it
I think it's also practicing these things with students in the moment, in the classroom. I know it's hard because it's often stretched to try and fit everything in, but if there's time to just do some regular practicing of self-regulation or checking in, what am I feeling now? Where do I feel it in my body? What do I need right now for myself? And helping them to develop things as a habit. I think, to me, that's the way it's to just try and get these things almost internalized so that in the moment, in the heat of the moment, there's more chance of being able, for a young person with ADHD, to be able to go, oh, I'm used to doing that. I know how to breathe. I know how to, what I can do to self-soothe. I know what my plan is. And I think those are beneficial skills for all students, regardless. It's like it's life skills.
I would definitely agree with that. Well, unless there are no more any more questions, I think that's probably a good place to leave it today. Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing, and hopefully everyone has been able to learn something from your presentation today. I know I have, and I will be going forth and discussing with the team tomorrow. So thank you very much. There's some lovely comments in the chat now as well. So that's oh, that's just come through to me, but I think it was supposed to go through. I'll just send it more to the Donna, your message has just come directly through to me instead of going through to Karen. So if you just wanted to post that again as a general message, then Karen will be able to see that.
Thanks. And also the slides. So you will be able to get the slides from the presentation.
Fantastic. We will send through the handout that you have provided us and the slides, along with an evaluation link and a link to some of the resources from your slides. I think we'll just try and chase those up so that the teachers and everyone who is here today are able to just click through to those links. Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you for joining us. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening, everybody. And stay tuned for our next workshop, which will be in term 3. So see you.
Bye.